At my cousin's engagement dinner at the Alinea, one of Chicago's most expensive restaurants, the room went dead silent. My cousin Brittany pointed a manicured finger at me and laughed into the microphone, saying, "I hope I never end up like her, a single mom with a fatherless kid." The room erupted in cruel laughter, and my Uncle Richard leaned back shouting that men do not want used goods. I stood there clutching my purse, while my own mother looked away in shame. But they did not know one thing. The groom Jamal was not just marrying into their family. He was my employee, and I had the power to shut down this entire celebration with a single text message. My name is Audrey. I am 34 years old, and to my family, I am nothing more than a cautionary tale, a single mother who works from home, doing odd jobs, and a stain on their pristine reputation. That night at the Alinea was supposed to be the happiest night of Brittany's life. She was marrying Jamal, the CEO of Apex Systems, a tech company that had just gone public. My Aunt Patricia and Uncle Richard were beaming, thinking they had finally secured a wealthy son-in-law to cover their mounting debts. I arrived 20 minutes late because my babysitter canceled last minute, and I had to drop my son Leo off at a neighbor's house. I rushed into the private dining room wearing my simple beige trench coat and flat shoes, looking nothing like the other guests in their sequins and tuxedos. The moment the heavy oak doors closed behind me, the jazz music stopped, and Brittany spotted me instantly with that familiar malicious glint. She tapped the microphone and called me the guest of honor and our resident charity case. Brittany continued, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, telling me she hoped I did not bring my stack of discount coupons tonight, because they do not use those at a $500 a plate dinner. A ripple of laughter went through the crowd, and I saw my Aunt Patricia cover her mouth to hide a smirk. I simply tightened my grip on my clutch, feeling the weight of the black titanium card inside the card that could buy this entire restaurant. I walked toward the only empty seat in the back, but Brittany was not done. She looked at Jamal and told him they needed to be careful, because one wrong move in life could lead to becoming used goods. Jamal was not smiling. His hands were clenched into fists on the white tablecloth, and he stared at his future wife with a look of pure disbelief. The term used goods hung in the air like a toxic cloud. To my family, my value had evaporated the moment I became a mother without a husband. I saw my Aunt Patricia nod in agreement, sipping her champagne as if her daughter had just recited a piece of poetry, rather than insulting her own blood. My Uncle Richard chuckled, a low rumbling sound that made my skin crawl. They viewed my life as a depreciation of an asset, a failure that made me unworthy of their high society world. I tightened my grip on the stem of my water glass, imagining it shattering in my palm. The urge to scream, to flip the table, and announce that I could buy and sell everyone in this room 10 times over was overwhelming, but I did not move. My face remained a mask of indifference, a skill I had honed over decades of being the family scapegoat. Next to Brittany, Jamal was vibrating with a silent rage. He looked like he was about to shove Richard's hand off his expensive suit jacket. To hear a man who barely managed a failing construction company give business advice to a tech CEO was laughable, but to hear him insult me was unbearable for Jamal. Just as Jamal opened his mouth to shatter their delusion and reveal the truth, my phone buzzed against my leg. It was a single vibration, distinct and urgent. I glanced down at the screen, keeping my movements subtle. It was a message from my vice president at the office. Even while being insulted at a family dinner, I was still the one steering the ship of a multi-million-dollar corporation. I looked up and caught Jamal's eye for a split second. I gave him a nearly imperceptible shake of my head. Not yet. I wanted them to feel the full height of their arrogance before the fall. I watched as Richard leaned over to Jamal, whispering loudly about how lucky he was to find a girl from a good home, unlike some other branches of the family tree. Brittany was glowing, soaking up the attention, oblivious to the fact that her fiancé was looking at her as if she were a stranger. I realized then that this wasn't just about my revenge. It was about saving Jamal from a life of misery with people who valued a bank account more than a human soul. I took a slow sip of water and waited for the next move in their cruel game. The dinner continued, but the atmosphere remained heavy with unspoken tension. Uncle Richard, leaning back in his chair like a king on a throne, suddenly signaled the waiter. He didn't just ask for the bill. He looked directly at me with a predatory grin. He told the table that since I was so quiet and observant throughout my cousin's engagement dinner, it was only fair that I covered the table. "Consider it your contribution to the family," he said, his voice booming. I looked down at the bill the waiter presented. $4,500. It was an exorbitant amount for a Tuesday night dinner meant to be a deliberate attempt to bankrupt me in front of everyone. Richard wanted to watch me struggle to find an excuse or beg for mercy. I looked at Richard calmly and told him I was invited to a dinner, not a fundraising event, and typically the host pays. Richard's face turned a dark shade of purple as he barked back about etiquette. He told me I was sitting there drinking expensive wine and eating steak on their dime, and that I should be grateful for the invite. Brittany chimed in laughing that maybe I could pay in installments or use the change from my odd jobs. The entire table watched, expecting me to break down or offer a tearful apology. Jamal started to stand up, his face contorted in anger, ready to end the charade, but I reached out and touched his arm under the table. I had a different plan. I reached into my simple clutch and pulled out the black titanium card. It was an invite-only card for high net worth individuals with no spending limit, a piece of metal that felt heavy and cold. The waiter took it with both hands, treating it like a holy relic, while his tone shifted from polite to reverent. Richard watched the transaction with a confused scowl, having never seen a card like that before. He scoffed, leaning back and crossing his arms, calling it a flashy piece of plastic and a predatory credit card with 30% interest. He told everyone I was digging myself deeper into debt just to show off. I watched the waiter walk away to process the payment, letting them believe I was drowning. It would only make the moment they realized I owned the ocean that much sweeter. I excused myself and headed to the ladies' room, a sanctuary of marble and gold. I turned on the brass faucet, letting the cold water run over my wrist to steady my nerves. The woman staring back in the mirror was not the broken, struggling single mother they thought she was. She was a shark in beige clothing. Just as I reached for a cloth towel, the doors swung open with aggressive force, and Brittany stormed in. The train of her white dress swept across the tiled floor as the door clicked shut. Her mask of the blushing demure bride vanished, replaced by the mean girl who used to lock me in the basement when we were children. She marched up to the sink next to mine, her eyes burning with a manic intensity. Brittany stood inches away from me, her face contorted with a mixture of jealousy and rage. She demanded to know where I got that card and how I dared to try and upstage her on her engagement night. She accused me of stealing it or finding some old sugar daddy to fund my pathetic life, just to make the family look bad. I didn't blink as she ranted about how I was a parasite and a stain on their reputation. She told me that after she married Jamal, she would make sure I was never invited to another family event again, and that my son Leo would grow up knowing exactly how much of a failure his mother was. She was spitting the words out, her manicured nails digging into the edge of the marble vanity. I stayed silent, letting her exhaust herself. When she finally ran out of breath, I looked at her reflection in the mirror and told her that she should be more concerned about her own future than my credit card. I told her that a marriage built on the expectation of someone else's money is a very dangerous game to play. Brittany laughed a shrill and hollow sound and told me that Jamal was the CEO of Apex Systems and that they were going to be the most powerful couple in Chicago. She bragged that her father had already discussed a partnership with Jamal that would save their family business. She looked at me with pure venom and told me that I was nothing but used goods, and that used goods always end up in the trash. As she turned to leave, she stopped at the door and whispered that she had a special surprise for me at the wedding. She said she wanted everyone to see exactly what kind of mother I was, and that she would make sure Leo was there to watch his mother get kicked out like the help. The cruelty in her voice was chilling. She wasn't just trying to hurt me anymore. She was targeting my son. I felt a cold resolve settle over me. The game of staying undercover was becoming a luxury I could no longer afford if it meant putting Leo at risk. I waited for her to leave before I pulled out my phone and sent a short text to Jamal. The merger is off and the wedding gift is canceled. Meet me in the lobby in 5 minutes. I walked back into the dining room to find the table in high spirits. Richard was bragging to the other guests about the new boat he was going to buy with his future son-in-law's money. Patricia was already planning the European tour they would take. They didn't even look at me as I picked up my clutch and walked toward the exit. Jamal was already standing there, his face pale and his eyes fixed on the door. He didn't say a word to Brittany or her parents. He just followed me out. Behind us, I could hear Richard's booming voice asking where the CEO was going. They had no idea that their golden ticket had just walked out the door and that the woman they had spent all night insulting was the one holding the leash. We stood in the quiet luxury of the Alinea lobby, the city lights of Chicago blurring behind the glass walls. Jamal looked like a man who had finally woken up from a nightmare. He apologized over and over, his voice shaking, as he told me he had no idea Brittany and her family were capable of such cruelty. He explained that Brittany had always played the perfect supportive partner when they were alone, but tonight the mask had shattered. I looked at him not as a cousin, but as the owner of the company that provided his livelihood. I told him that while I valued his work at Apex Systems, I could not have my top executives tied to people who viewed human beings as disposable assets. Jamal nodded firmly, telling me he was done and that he couldn't marry into a family that treated his mentor and boss with such disrespect. The next morning, the fallout began. My Uncle Richard and Aunt Patricia were calling my phone incessantly, but I directed all calls to my assistant. They were starting to realize that Jamal wasn't answering his phone either. The wedding was only 3 days away, and the vendors were starting to demand final payments that Richard couldn't cover. I sat in my high-rise office looking out over the lake and realized that the time for quiet observation was over. I called my legal team and instructed them to pull the funding for the construction project Richard had been using to keep his failing company afloat. It was a project secretly backed by one of my subsidiaries, and it was the only thing keeping him from total bankruptcy. I decided that simply walking away wasn't enough. They needed to understand the magnitude of their mistake. I sent an official RSVP for the wedding confirming that not only would I be attending, but I would be bringing a guest. I wanted to see the look on their faces when they realized the used goods they had mocked was the one who owned the roof over their heads. Meanwhile, Jamal moved his things out of the penthouse. Brittany had already started decorating with his money. He sent her a brief message telling her the wedding was on hold, but I knew better. The wedding wasn't on hold. It was becoming the stage for their final reckoning. That afternoon, I went to pick up Leo from school. As he ran toward me with a drawing of a rocket ship, I felt a pang of guilt for letting him near those people, even for a second. He asked if we were going to see Aunt Brittany again, and I told him that we were going to a big party soon. But after that, we wouldn't have to see them for a very long time. I spent the rest of the day finalizing the paperwork that would transfer Jamal's employment contract to our international branch in London. I wanted him far away from the toxic influence of the Vance family. But first he had a part to play in the final act. The stage was set for the most expensive disaster in the family's history. The day of the wedding arrived, and the grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel was a sea of white roses and expensive silk. My Uncle Richard was walking around with a forced smile, but I could see the sweat on his brow. He had spent the morning dodging calls from the florist and the caterer, whose checks had started to bounce. He still thought Jamal would show up at the last minute and save him with a wire transfer. I arrived wearing a custom charcoal power suit that screamed authority, and I walked through the doors with my head held high. The room fell silent as I passed. Word had gotten out about the black titanium card, and the guests were whispering. My mother tried to pull me aside, telling me I shouldn't be here, but I simply walked past her toward the front row. Brittany appeared at the top of the grand staircase, looking like a princess in a dress that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. But as she scanned the room, her smile faltered. The groom's side of the aisle was nearly empty. Jamal's family and friends were nowhere to be seen. She spotted me sitting in the front row, and her face twisted in a snarl even under her veil. She marched down the aisle not with grace, but with a frantic energy. When she reached the altar, she didn't look for her groom. She looked at my Uncle Richard and hissed about where Jamal was. Richard looked like he was about to have a heart attack, whispering that Jamal wasn't answering his texts, but that he must be on his way. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. Jamal walked in, but he wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He was in a business suit, and he was carrying a briefcase. The gasps from the audience were audible. Brittany rushed toward him, crying about how late he was and how he needed to go get changed. Jamal didn't move. He looked at her with a coldness that seemed to freeze the air in the room. He told her there would be no wedding today. Richard ran forward, shouting about the embarrassment and the money and demanding that Jamal stop this nonsense. Jamal simply opened his briefcase and pulled out a single legal document, and he didn't hand it to Richard. He handed it to me. I stood up, and the room went so quiet, you could hear the air conditioning hum. Richard demanded to know what I was doing and why his son-in-law was giving me papers. I looked him dead in the eye and told him that Jamal was never his son-in-law, but he had always been my subordinate. I explained that I was the majority shareholder of Apex Systems and the owner of the holding company that had just foreclosed on Richard's construction firm that morning. Brittany screamed, calling me a liar and a jealous bitch, but Jamal stepped forward and spoke into the altar microphone. He told the entire room that he owed his career to me, and that he would never marry a woman who treated the person he respected most like used goods. The ballroom erupted into a frenzy of whispers and shocked gasps as the truth settled over the guests like a heavy fog. Brittany stood in the center of the aisle, her expensive veil trailing on the floor, looking less like a bride and more like a ghost. She tried to reach for Jamal's arm, but he stepped back with a look of pure revulsion. My Uncle Richard was trembling, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson as he pointed a shaking finger at me. He screamed that I was a traitor and that I had set them up to fail. I looked at him with a calm that only added to his fury. I told him that I didn't set him up, I simply stopped holding him up. I explained that his business had been a hollow shell for years, kept alive by the very charity he accused me of needing. I pulled out my phone and tapped a few keys, signaling my team to release the final foreclosure notices. Richard watched as his own phone began to buzz in his pocket over and over. Every creditor he had lied to, every vendor he had promised money to, and every bank he had defrauded was now calling at once. Patricia fell into a nearby chair, her face pale, as she realized the European tours and the high society life were vanishing in real time. Brittany turned on me, her voice a shrill scream of desperation. "You ruined my life," she shrieked. "You were always just the pathetic single mom we had to pity, and now you do this?" I looked at her and told her that pity was never what I needed from them, but respect was what they had failed to give. Jamal stood by my side, his presence a solid wall of support. He told the gathered crowd that the wedding was officially canceled and that the reception would not be happening because the catering bill had not been paid. The hotel staff who had been waiting for the signal moved in and began to systematically take down the flower arrangements and close the bar. It was a brutal and public dismantling of a fantasy. Richard tried to grab Jamal's lapel, but 2 security guards I had hired stepped in his way. I told my uncle that he had 2 choices: he could leave quietly, or he could wait for the police, who were already on their way to discuss the fraudulent financial statements he had submitted to my subsidiary. Brittany began to sob, but it wasn't the sob of a broken heart. It was the sob of someone who had lost their golden ticket. She looked around at the guests, many of whom were her wealthy friends, and saw only judgment and embarrassment. They were already checking their watches and heading for the exits, not wanting to be associated with a family that had just been publicly destroyed. I walked toward the door, my heels clicking on the marble floor, and I didn't look back once. I had spent years being their punching bag, being the person they laughed at to feel better about themselves. But as I walked out of the Drake Hotel, I felt lighter than I had in a decade. The debt of their arrogance was finally being paid in full. I walked out of the Drake Hotel and into the cool Chicago air, feeling the heavy weight of the last decade finally lift off my shoulders. Jamal followed me to the waiting black car, his briefcase tight in his hand, and a look of immense relief on his face. He told me that he felt like he had just escaped a sinking ship, and he thanked me for showing him the truth before he signed his life away. I looked at the Grand Hotel behind us, knowing that inside my Uncle Richard and Aunt Patricia were facing the total collapse of their social and financial world. They had spent their lives building a house of cards on a foundation of insults, and today the wind had finally blown it all down. We drove to pick up Leo from my neighbor's house, and the moment he saw me, he ran into my arms with a giant smile. He didn't know about the foreclosures, the canceled wedding, or the millions of dollars that had changed hands. He only knew that his mommy was home and that she looked happy. I held him tight and realized that everything I had done was for this moment. I wanted him to grow up in a world where your value isn't determined by a wedding ring or a family name, but by the strength of your character and the work of your hands. Jamal watched us with a soft smile, and I knew that he was ready for his new start in London, far away from the toxicity of the Vance family. The fallout from the wedding was legendary in Chicago social circles. Richard lost his construction company, his house, and his reputation within a month. He and Patricia had to move into a small rental apartment in a part of town they used to mock. and Richard spent most of his days in legal depositions regarding his fraudulent business practices. Brittany became a social pariah, her name synonymous with the most expensive failed wedding in the city's history. She tried to reach out to Jamal dozens of times, but his number was disconnected and his social media was private. They were finally forced to live the humble life they had tried so hard to convince everyone I was living. I sat in my office a few weeks later, watching the sunset over Lake Michigan. My phone vibrated with a message from my mother asking for a loan to help Richard, but I simply deleted it. The poor cousin was gone, the victim was gone, and the only thing left was the woman who owned the future. I had balanced the ledger, and the price of their greed had been paid in full. I looked at Leo playing with his toy cars on the rug, and I knew we were finally safe. I had built an empire in silence, while they shouted their insults at the wind, and now the only sound left was the quiet peace of a life well lived. We were done with people who made us feel small, and from now on, we only allowed people into our lives who knew how to cherish us.